spear, that whosoever claims it and solves its secrets holds the destiny of the world in his hands for good or for evil. Hitler went and saw the spear, and he believed, number 18, the spear held the key to power, the key to its own world historic destiny. As I said before, the book entitled The Spear of Destiny was written about the spear and Hitler's fascination with it. The author says this, number 19, the Fuhrer, meaning Hitler, underwent the first experience of demonic possession by Lucifer before the Spear of Destiny in Vienna. And further he said that Hitler, number 20, stood before the spear and made an irreversible vow to worship evil. He quotes Hitler as saying this, number 21, I knew with immediacy that this was an important moment in my life. Hitler had to possess the spear to fulfill his destiny, and we're going to see just how he moved to obtain the spear before he started World War II. But before we discuss that, I'd like to put one more part of the puzzle into place. With all of this background in occultism, why would anyone want to support Adolf Hitler for anything, let alone Premier of Germany? I believe that honest historians can now answer that question, and I'd like to attempt to answer that question myself. Way back in the early 1960s, when I first started collecting material on the subject of this conspiracy, I saved this article. As you can see, there is no indication where the article came from, other than it is a, quote, gossip column, unquote, written by Robin Adams Sloan. I believe the article came from the Portland Oregonian newspaper in the late 60s, 1960s. But precisely dating the article is not important, because as we shall see, the article refers to a book that I have read that assists us in understanding the information inside the article. And we'll come to that in a moment. Let's read the article. The question asked in this column was this, number 22. Have you heard the rumor that Hitler was himself Jewish and tried to wipe out his own people? As we have previously seen, Hitler and the Thule Society were convinced that the Jewish people were evil and had to be removed from the nation. And as we know, the stories about mass exterminations of Jews in Germany have been part of our history ever since the end of World War II. So here the gossip columnist was asked about the possibility that Adolf Hitler was himself Jewish or part Jewish. The answer to that question was as follows, number 23. The rumor has been around for some time. Hitler's grandmother, Maria Anna Schicklgruber, was living in Vienna at the time she conceived Adolf's father. She was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild, but immediately after her pregnancy became known, Maria Anna was sent home to Spital, and that's the way I don't know how to pronounce it, we'll pronounce it Spital, Austria, where her son was born. Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss reportedly had the Austrian police investigate Hitler's background. This, some say, caused Hitler to precipitate events in Austria and initiate the assassination of Dollfuss. The dictator didn't want any question to arise of his father's having possibly been conceived by a Rothschild, instead of by Johann Georg Hiedler, as the record states. If a Rothschild were his forebearer, this would make Hitler 1/4 Jewish. This interesting thesis has been advanced in a new book called, or entitled rather, The Mind of Adolf Hitler by Walter Langer, a noted psychiatrist. It is known that Nazi SS members dressed up in Austrian army uniforms assassinated Chancellor Dollfuss on July the 24th, 1934. And less than 4 years later, in March of 1938, Hitler's troops moved into Austria. Within 3 days, Hitler possessed the Spear of Destiny. His plans for the bloodiest war in history could now be brought about. I'd like to now mention the book written by Walter Langer, and here it is. It's called The Mind of Adolf Hitler, The Secret Wartime Report, written by Walter Langer. Dr. Langer, by the way, is an American psychiatrist, and he was asked in 1943 to prepare a psychological analysis of Hitler for the Allies, meaning the United States and Germany, United States, England, and France. In his book, on pages 107 and 108, Dr. Langer basically says the same thing about the Sloan, the same thing that the Sloan article says. That point is that many considered Hitler to be the illegitimate grandson of a Rothschild. And we've talked about the Rothschilds and their role in this conspiracy in the past. Now that we know a little bit about the satanic background of Adolf Hitler, there is one more part of the puzzle we must put into place before we start our study of World War II. One must become familiar with a chemical and pharmaceutical cartel known as number 24, IG Farben. IG stands for, and I'll pronounce this the best I can, Interstand Gemeinschaft, which I've been told means community of interest, or more simply, cartel. We've defined cartel in the past before. Number 25. Without IG's immense economic power, Germany would not have been in a position to start its aggressive war in September 1939. In other words, without IG Farben, there would have been no World War II. And number 26. Without the capital supplied by Wall Street, there would have been no IG Farben. The money to create IG Farben came from J.P. Morgan and Company, who loaned $800 million to create this gigantic chemical cartel. And 3 Wall Street brokers, including Dillon Reed and Company, handled the loans to create IG Farben. One of the major products produced by IG Farben was this Zyklon B gas, the lethal gas used in the concentration camps in Germany during World War II to gas the Jews. It was used at Auschwitz. Most people, when they hear the name of Auschwitz, immediately think of the brutal concentration camps that were located there. Few know or will admit that there was also a factory nearby producing synthetic rubber and synthetic gasoline. That factory was being run by IG Farben. It was supplied with workers from the concentration camp at Auschwitz. The SS doctors who ran the camp made certain that the factory only received the strongest inmates to work there. We'll point out why that's significant in a minute. In November of 1944, during the war, John Peel, executive director of the War Refugee Board, wrote to the United States War Department urging them to bomb the Auschwitz industrial plants. Their reply to John Peel was that would be, quote, unwarranted diversion of planes needed elsewhere, unquote. One building never bombed during World War II was the central office building which housed IG Farben. IG Farben ran the concentration camps at Auschwitz and other places around Germany. Isn't that interesting? IG Farben does not get destroyed. I think if you were going to win a war, you'd want to destroy the major chemical combine, unless that enemy was not your enemy, but your ally. Don't forget that it was American capital that constructed IG Farben. So it was not the Germans who gassed the Jews, it was a group of Americans who created the chemical cartel that produced the Zyklon B gas. But creating a poisonous gas was not new to World War II and IG Farben. They had produced the chlorine poisonous gas used in World War I, IG Farben. But I.G. Farben had a far more important product for Germany's war machine: gasoline. During World War I, Germany discovered it had a problem. It had no source of gasoline, but it did have extensive coal deposits. In the 1920s, a German scientist from Farben started developing a process that could make gasoline from coal. Standard Oil became extremely interested and sent one of its engineers to investigate the process being developed. He reported back to Walter Teagle, the president of Standard Oil, that the process worked. He reported that if they developed the process fully, it would mean that Europe, which had extensive coal deposits, would become independent of Standard Oil and its world markets. Something had to be done, and it was. Standard Oil and I.G. Farben signed a cartel agreement on November the 9th, 1929. The 1929 cartel agreement had two objectives, number 27. First, it granted Standard Oil 1/2 of all rights to the hydrogenation process. That's the process that converted coal to gasoline in all countries of the world except Germany. Secondly, number 28, the two agreed never to compete with each other in the fields of chemistry and petroleum products. In the future, if Standard Oil wished to enter the broad field of industrial chemicals or drugs, it would do so only as a partner of I.G. Farben. In turn, I.G. Farben agreed never to enter the field of petroleum except as a joint venture with Standard. Number 29. In the words of a Standard official, the I.G. are going to stay out of the oil business, and we are going to stay out of the chemical business. So the two giants had made peace in Germany. Standard Oil now had a say in what was going to be produced in Germany, in wartime Germany. Standard Oil also was busy in Germany developing regular oil resources. In 1936, the American ambassador to Germany quoted an official of a Northern Oil Company as saying, number 30, "The Standard Oil Company of New York has spent 10 million marks in Germany trying to find oil resources and in building a great refinery near Hamburg." I'd like to shift the emphasis on World War II from Germany to the United States and cover an event that has real significance in understanding the situation in America prior to the war. Between July and November of 1933, some wealthy Americans were planning on changing the form of America's economy and the form of its government. The details of this plot were covered in this book entitled The Plot, there it is, The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. He writes about how Major General Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps was sought by wealthy plotters in the United States, number 31, to lead a putsch, meaning a dictatorship, a revolution, to overthrow the government and establish an American fascist dictatorship. I'd like to remind you, number 32, that fascism is defined as government control but not ownership of the factors of production, meaning the capital goods. Notice that this revolution was not to be led by the downtrodden masses yearning to be free of the despised or dreaded economic system known as capitalism. It was to be led by the very wealthy. These are the people who we have been taught have the most to lose by this economic system known as fascism. Yet, just as we've learned in many so-called communist revolutions, it's the wealthy leading the way. Who were the wealthy that wanted fascism in this country? Major General Butler was approached by three men, number 33. Robert S. Clark, a banker who had inherited a large fortune from a founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. John W. Davis, the 1924 Democratic candidate for president and now chief attorney for J.P. Morgan and Company. And the third name, Grayson Mallet Provost, a director of Guarantee Trust, a J.P. Morgan bank. Once again, it seemed that J.P. Morgan was involving himself in America's history. Now, what did they offer the general? They tempted the general with the plot, number 34, with the biggest bribe ever offered to any American, the opportunity to become the first dictator of the United States. The general was an odd choice, by the way. This is very interesting. He was an odd choice because he had made some very strong statements about the true nature of things in America. He'd written this, number 35. War is a racket. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. War was largely a matter of money. Bankers lend money to foreign countries, and when these countries cannot repay, the president sends Marines to get it. I know. I've been involved in 11 of these expeditions. He went on. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902-1912. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. In 1934, the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee in the Senate of the United States, number 36, confirmed Butler's suspicions that big business, Standard Oil, and the big banks had been behind most of the military interventions he had been ordered to lead. Once again, Standard Oil and the big banks. Butler was told that he would be given $3 million and $300 million if he needed it to lead the dictatorship, the revolution. He was told that in about 1 year he could expect to raise an army of 500,000 men. The plan was to have the army of 500,000 men march on Washington with Butler at its head. Then they would declare the President, Roosevelt, was ill and that Butler was taking over as his aide. Roosevelt would be allowed to remain as president, but only as a ceremonial figurehead. You might recall that this scenario is strikingly similar to the one designed by Colonel Edward Mandell House in this book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. We've talked about this book in the past and what its contents are. In this book, Colonel House has Philip Drew march on to Washington at the head of a 500,000-man army. Isn't that interesting? Once again, 500,000. We're going to see that number one more time in a couple of weeks, 500,000. When Drew takes over as the administrator of the American government in the book, Philip Drew, Administrator, he gave America number 37, Socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx was given to the American government by Philip Drew, Administrator, Colonel Edward Mandell House's hero. You might also recall that Colonel House was a personal friend of Franklin Roosevelt. However, in the Butler scenario, I do not believe that Butler was to get the power he had been promised. It is my opinion that the plotters were going to use the incident for Roosevelt to further increase his presidential powers. In my opinion, the plotters wanted President Roosevelt to impose fascism down on the American people using the mob scene led by Major General Butler as their excuse. Butler would march his troops into Washington. Roosevelt would declare a national emergency and suspend the Constitution. But General Butler would not buy the plot. He listened attentively and then took his story to Congressman John McCormick, later to become the Speaker of the House. Mr. McCormick and the committee he co-chaired, called the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, listened and believed the general. The committee submitted a report that said this, number 38. The committee was able to verify all the pertinent statements made by General Butler. So the wealthy plotters could not bring fascism to America through a confrontation. So they set about to bring it through more subtle ways by going through the cabinet of the United States. Roosevelt wanted fascism in this country. Now this is Frances Perkins, who President Roosevelt appointed to his cabinet in 1933 as the Secretary of Labor. She was quoted as she discussed her first cabinet meeting after Roosevelt was elected. She described how fascism was going to be brought to America, number 39. At the first meeting of the cabinet in 1933, now notice she's saying, I'm at the cabinet meeting as the Department Secretary of Labor, and at that first meeting after Roosevelt was inaugurated and elected, she's going to talk about that meeting. She says, Bernard Baruch, by the way, Bernard Baruch was an advisor and key financial advisor, supporter to President Roosevelt. Bernard Baruch came in with a copy of a book by Gentile, the Italian fascist theoretician, for each member of the cabinet, and we all read it with care. Bernard Baruch brought in a book about fascism and asked the cabinet to read it, and all of the members of the cabinet read it with care, she says. So what the wealthy plotters could not get through revolution, they were going to get through administration. We're going to get government control through the cabinet and President Roosevelt, but he wouldn't call it fascism. Now that the plan was on schedule, President Roosevelt could direct his attention back to the war. Jim Farley was appointed by President Roosevelt as the Postmaster General, and there's a picture of Jim Farley. Farley attended the second cabinet meeting and wrote about it in a book that he's written called Jim Farley's Story. He said this, number 40, at the second cabinet meeting in 1933, notice the year, 1933, the President discussed possible plans of action in the event of war with Japan. Notice that this was in 1933, 8 years before World War II. President Roosevelt was discussing how we could protect ourselves in the event Japan attacked America. 8 years before Japan attacked America at Pearl Harbor in a, quote, surprise, unquote, attack. We have been told for 47 years that Japan caught America off guard at Pearl Harbor. Yet Jim Farley said that President Roosevelt started concerning himself about a war with Japan in 1933. How are you surprised after 8 years? As we'll see a little later, President Roosevelt knew that Japan would attack America probably at Pearl Harbor as early as 1919, which was 14 years before his cabinet meeting. We'll discuss Pearl Harbor, if not tonight, next week. I'd like to shift the attention of our study of World War II back to Germany and discuss how America built Germany's war machine. We've already discussed how Standard Oil assisted I.G. Farben in developing the technology to make gasoline from coal. Without that technology, Germany would never have been able to wage a war of the magnitude of World War II. But American capitalists provided far more in the way of strategic technology. Much of what I'm going to cover in our study of World War II has come from this book entitled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony C. Sutton, and there's the book. Here is the incredible story of the American financiers who provided the money and material Hitler used to launch World War II. The dust cover on the back of the book says that this book makes every previous book on World War II obsolete. That statement is true because Professor Sutton documents how American capitalists constructed Germany's war machine for World War II. In October of 1936, William Dodd, the U.S. ambassador to Germany, wrote the following message to President Roosevelt from Berlin, number 41. More than 100 American corporations have subsidiaries here or cooperative understandings. Standard Oil Company sent $2 million here in December 1933, and has made $500,000 a year helping Germans make gas. Notice, Standard Oil was helping the Germans make gasoline in 1936. For what purpose? Mr. Dodd, the ambassador, says, for war purposes. Notice that Ambassador Dodd admitted that these capitalists were building a German war machine. Those Americans knew in advance. But notice one more thing that is even far more damaging. If Ambassador Dodd knew that these people were building Hitler's war machine, and if he told the President Roosevelt, these facts, that means that Franklin Roosevelt knew and then did nothing. Franklin Roosevelt sent American fighting men to die in Germany, knowing that those who were there to kill him, the Germans, were armed and supplied by American corporations. Now, I don't know what anyone else calls that, but I call it murder. Let me continue with Ambassador Dodd's report. The International Harvester Company president told me their business rose 33% a year. Even our airplane people have secret arrangements with Krupp's. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Krupp's, let me briefly explain. Krupp's was a giant company that constructed the arms, tanks, and related equipment to Hitler's war machine. Newsweek magazine said that Krupp's ran the sickest slave program in the German Reich. For example, during the war, Krupp's ran a factory manufacturing aircraft parts at Auschwitz that used slave labor from the concentration camps. And Ambassador Dodd tells us that the American airplane companies had secret arrangements with Krupp's, and they used slave labor. But you already knew that, didn't you? Because America's free press has already told you. I'm just repeating what you've heard millions of times, aren't I? I want you to notice another interesting thing. Whenever you talk about the Holocaust, the gassing of the 6 million Jews in the German concentration camps, like the one at Auschwitz, ask yourself why you don't talk about the German corporations with their secret arrangements with the American corporations. Or maybe you do, because America's free press keeps reminding you. Think about that. Professor Sutton goes on to say this, number 42. The two largest tank producers in Hitler's Germany were Opel, a wholly owned subsidiary of General Motors, controlled by, guess who? The J.P. Morgan firm, and the Ford AG subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company of Detroit. Alcoa and Dow Chemical worked closely with Nazi industry with numerous transfers of their domestic U.S. technology. Bendix Aviation, in which the J.P. Morgan controlled General Motors, had a major stock interest, supplied Germany with data on automatic pilots and aircraft instruments. As late as 1940, Bendix Aviation supplied complete technical data for aircraft and diesel engine starters. In 1939, the German electrical equipment industry was concentrated into a few major corporations linked in an international cartel and by stock ownership to two major U.S. corporations, International General Electric and International Telephone and Telegraph. This industrial complex, and listen to this, this industrial complex was never a prime target for bombing in World War II. The electrical equipment plants bombed as targets were not affiliated with U.S. firms. I first heard of this fact, that certain targets were not bombed in Germany in World War II in 1961, when I met an American who was a prisoner of war in World War II. He had been captured by the Japanese. He told me that a friend of his had been a prisoner of war in Germany and had been forced to work in a steel mill in Germany during the war. He told me that whenever an American bombing raid struck their German city where the steel mill was located, the American POWs in that camp would make certain that they were always inside the steel building itself, instead of an outside building on the premises. He said that the steel mill never was bombed during the war, and that the surrounding buildings were bombed. In other words, our bombers were very selective. One could say that the bombers were just poor marksmen and that they just couldn't hit the steel mill. But a more reasonable explanation, and one that didn't occur to me for over 20 years, was that the steel mill was probably owned by some Americans. One might ask, who made the decisions as to which targets in Germany were to be bombed? The Constitution states that the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces. During World War II, the Commander-in-Chief was President Franklin Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt who selected the German targets. This book, entitled Wall Street and FDR, was also written by Professor Sutton. This book shows clearly that his research has shown that many of the capitalists who constructed Germany's war machine also supported Roosevelt in his campaigns for the presidency. But you might say, the Americans who built the factories and transferred the technology to Hitler did not know that it was leading to a war. Professor Sutton lays that statement to rest with this comment, number 43. Not only was an influential sector of American business aware of the nature of Nazism, but for its own purposes aided Nazism whenever possible and profitable, with full knowledge that the probable outcome would be war involving Europe and the United States. But you might say, surely they had no knowledge that Hitler intended to use that technology to brutally liquidate millions of Jews in Europe. I see we're running out of time, so next week we'll continue our discussion of this story about how America built Germany's war machine and how that war machine killed millions of people, including Americans, all over Europe and in America. So I invite you to tune us in next week again as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you very, very much. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I wrote my book and then published it, and there it is. It's called The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. The book came out in 1985. Tonight's session is number 21 in the series, and tonight we're going to continue our study of World War II. Last week we discussed the fact that American capitalists constructed Germany's war machine for that war, and many people have been critical of that position by saying, and have said, that these capitalists did not know that Hitler wanted to wage a bloody war during the 30s or to eliminate 6 million Jewish people during the war. I'd like to give you a couple of examples, at least one, that shows that that statement just isn't true. In November of 1938, the SS newspaper called the Black Corps called for number 44, the extermination with fire and sword, the actual and final end of Jewry in Germany. All that these capitalists had to do to know for certain about what Hitler's plans were was to read the paper, the newspaper, or to read Hitler's Hitler's book entitled Mein Kampf. He wrote about the problem in his book as he saw it, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies prior to the war. The American capitalists did know what Hitler's plans were, and they continued to build the German war machine prior to the war. And 50 million people died because of that fact. The war started on March the 11th, 1938, when Hitler's Germany invaded Austria. On August the 23rd, 1939, Germany and Russia signed a pact, a treaty, with a secret clause that divided the nation of Poland between the two nations. It also gave the nation of Lithuania to the Germans, and Finland, Estonia, and Latvia to Russia. And on September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded the western part of Poland. And 15 days later, Germany's ally, Russia, invaded the eastern part of Poland. World War II had begun. It's interesting to note that when Hitler moved into Poland, England and France both declared war on Germany. But when the Russian government moved into their share of Poland, England and France did not declare war on Russia. That's very interesting, and we'll try to explain why that is in a few moments. Russia would later become an ally of France and Great Britain during World War II. It sounds to me like France and England knew the game plan. Today's enemy is tomorrow's ally. So you don't declare war against your future ally. After Germany invaded Poland, reporters were concerned that America would get into the war. They asked President Roosevelt, the President of the United States at the time, can we stay out of the war? And Roosevelt responded, number 45, I believe we can, and every effort will be made by the administration to do so. Roosevelt said, we're going to stay out of the war. Remember that we're going to show you that statement was not true. On September the 1st, 1939, President Roosevelt appointed George Marshall as Chief of Staff of the Army over General Douglas MacArthur, a senior officer in time of seniority. It's traditional to give that job generally to the chief officer, the one with the most seniority. But in this case, they gave it to George Marshall, and I believe the reason is apparent, or at least can be known, as to why Roosevelt did that. George Marshall was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We've discussed that group in the past, and General MacArthur was not. That says a great deal about the future conduct of the war. It'll explain a great deal, as we're going to see. Later in September, Roosevelt said this, number 46, this nation will remain a neutral nation. Now, for the next few minutes, I want you to keep saying to yourself silently, I believe my government. We wanted to remain neutral. Now, we've been told by those who write the Accidental School of History that President Roosevelt wanted to keep us out of World War II. During the 1940 campaign, President Roosevelt was seeking re-election. Here's what he said, number 47. And while I am talking to you mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. But just like his predecessor and his mentor, Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt did in what Woodrow Wilson did in World War I, Roosevelt did in World War II. Roosevelt had made commitments to England to get us involved in the war as soon as they could. General Albert Wedemeyer saw through the charade of Roosevelt's neutrality. Here's what Wedemeyer wrote, number 48. Roosevelt knew that the only way he could fulfill his secret commitments to Churchill to get us into the war without openly dishonoring his pledges to the American people to keep us out of the war was by provoking Germany or Japan to attack. Did you hear that? General Wedemeyer said that Roosevelt had a secret agreement with Winston Churchill, and just like Colonel Edward Mandell House had made with Sir Edward Grey of England for World War I. Roosevelt needed an incident to inflame the American people into becoming involved in the war. Either Germany or Japan would do. Roosevelt started selling arms to England and released U.S. ships to convoy the British ships carrying those arms to get involved with World War II. But Hitler was seeking to avoid a war with the United States. He had told his naval commanders to avoid incidents with the United States, while the campaign in Europe was going on. Standard Oil and Shell Oil started doing their part in assisting Hitler with his war effort. This is a picture that appeared in Life magazine on February the 19th, 1940, just after the invasion of Austria and Poland. The caption reads under the picture, quote, "Oil for Germany moves in these tank cars of American Esso Lube and British Shell." Esso Lube is the English, I believe, part of Standard Oil. Esso stands for SO, Standard Oil. So here we saw a picture of Esso, Standard Oil, and Shell developing and delivering oil to Germany during the war. That was nearly 2 years after Germany had invaded Austria, and about 6 months after Germany invaded Poland. And two of the world's largest oil companies are carrying oil for Germany's war machine. Something's going on. Not only was Standard Oil carrying oil for Germany on land, they were also carrying oil for Germany on the ocean. Number 49. In 1941, Standard Oil of New Jersey, now called Exxon, had 6 Standard Oil tankers under Panamanian registry manned by Nazi officers to carry fuel oil from Standard Oil refineries to the Canary Islands, a refueling base of Nazi submarine. Ask yourself this question: whose side was Standard Oil on? Most people presume that they were on the American side because they were an American oil company. But here we see it assisting the German socialists in their war killing people. Some others questioned Standard Oil's motives and patriotism as well. In 1941, the British Security Coordination, part of the British government, issued a statement that read thusly, number 50, Standard Oil could be scarcely regarded as an American business machine. It was a hostile and dangerous agency of the enemy, Germany. Since Germany wouldn't attack America, pressure had to be brought on Japan to do the job instead of getting us into that war. An historian by the name of Charles Callan Tansel has discovered that President Woodrow Wilson had started pressuring Japan way back in 1915. His article in this book entitled Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and the Coming of War, it's a series of articles on the Pearl Harbor, the plan for Pearl Harbor, and in that book, Mr. Tansel says this, number 51, under Woodrow Wilson, a 3-pronged offensive was launched against Japan. Since 1913, that nation had been under almost constant attack by the Department of State. Why were we attacking Japan in 1915, 20-some years prior to Pearl Harbor? Also, Franklin Roosevelt had known since 1913 that Japan, if it ever wanted to war against America, would launch a surprise attack against the United States. According to this book, entitled Roosevelt and Churchill by Joseph P. Lash, there it is, a partnership that saved the West, Roosevelt and Churchill. Mr. Lash commented that a crisis occurred between the Japanese and Americans in 1913 when Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Mr. Lash tells us this, number 52. Admiral Bradley A. Fisk, the official strategist of the Navy, had sent Josephus Daniels, who was the Secretary of the Navy, and by the way, as you might recall, when we covered World War I, Franklin Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of Navy to Josephus Daniels. So here we've got an admiral sending Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, a confidential memorandum with a copy to Roosevelt, warning that Japan might launch a sudden attack upon the United States. Mr. Lash then quotes a Roosevelt biographer, Frank Friedel, number 53. Daniel scoffed at this idea, but Roosevelt listened and remembered back in 1913 or thereabouts. Roosevelt continued that pressure on Japan. On July the 26th, 1939, Roosevelt gave the stipulated 2 years' notice on the termination of America's trade treaty of 1911 with Tokyo. The U.S. then embargoed shipments of oil to Japan. You might know from your study of the map, the world map, that Japan is an island and needs to import her raw materials. This force, this action of Franklin Roosevelt forced Japan to move out in search of new markets. Number 54. General Douglas MacArthur said that as early as 1935, we should have recognized Japan's expansionist policies would eventually lead to a confrontation in the Pacific. General MacArthur understood the game plan. I believe that's one of the reasons why General MacArthur did not become Chief of Staff and George Marshall did. MacArthur was not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The next important step in getting Japan to attack America occurred in August of 1940 when the United States broke the Japanese War Code. The United States manufactured machines to decode any Japanese message. These machines were called the Purple Machine, I guess, decoders, and they were distributed to American bases all over the Far East. But none of these machines were sent to Pearl Harbor. I'm certain that was just a careless oversight, I'm sure. I'm sure they wanted Pearl Harbor to have one. In August of 1940, the National Guard was voted into federal service for 1 year. On September the 16th, 1940, the Selective Service Act was passed with a 1 year's duration. In other words, we're getting prepared for war all the time that Franklin Roosevelt is telling us there will be no war or no involvement of American troops in World War II. We were not being neutral. Mr. Roosevelt had made a commitment to Winston Churchill. But the next step was perhaps the most important of all. On September the 28th, 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact. This agreement, number 56, pledged mutual assistance if any one of the signatories were attacked by a power at present not involved in the European War or the Sino-Japanese conflict. In other words, any one of the three that was attacked by a non-belligerent could expect the help of the other two. According to this book, entitled The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn, Roosevelt was looking for an incident with Japan so that he could get into the war he wanted. Roosevelt knew that war with Japan would automatically mean war with Germany because of the Tripartite Treaty. In October of 1940, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, sent for Admiral J.O. Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the American Fleet in the Pacific. Number 57. The President wanted the Admiral Richardson to establish a patrol of the Pacific, a wall of American naval vessels stretched across the Western Pacific in such a way as to make it impossible for Japan to reach any of her sources of supply. Number 58. Correctly and wisely, Admiral Richardson protested vigorously. He said that that would be an act of war, and besides, we would lose our Navy. Of course, Roosevelt had to abandon his plan. Now, I want you to notice something very interesting in that last quote we just read. It was Secretary of War Knox who asked the Admiral, notice, he asked the Admiral to do this, to spread the ships out all over the Pacific. And you'll notice it was not the President, Roosevelt, who had the power to order the Admiral to do it. They went to him and asked him to do it. Now, why didn't the President, who apparently wanted this program, why didn't he just order the Admiral to do it? He's got the power. Don't forget, the President is the Commander-in-Chief. Why didn't he say, Richardson, do it, and it would be done? One can only presume that Roosevelt was looking for a scapegoat so that when the Japanese attacked the patrol, he could say that it was not him that had ordered the patrol, but it was the Admiral that established it on his own, and then the press could blame Admiral Richardson, not Franklin Roosevelt. And the President would have his incident, and we would be at war with Japan, just like he wanted. Admiral Richardson became concerned with the protection of the fleet at Pearl Harbor and went to Washington twice in 1940. Don't forget, Pearl Harbor is not for another year yet, early December 1941. So Richardson went to Washington to recommend that the fleet be withdrawn from Pearl Harbor. He claimed there were at least two major problems. He said this, the admiral did, number 59. The ships of the fleet were inadequately manned for war. Notice, war in 1940. They were anticipating it. And secondly, the fleet defenses against both air and submarine attacks were far below the required standards of strength. Now, when Admiral Richardson went to Franklin Roosevelt, and the press picked up on the story, was he hailed as being a great American patriot who concerned himself with the lives of the sailors in armed forces and the Air Force, the Army Air Force at Pearl Harbor? No. Admiral Richardson was relieved of his command in January 1941. Don't tell me the truth, Roosevelt said. I don't want to hear it. In other words, we don't want Pearl Harbor to be protected. We don't want them to be able to decipher any messages from the Japanese war code so that they might be able to be protected and they could intercept those messages. Those who discover that fact had best be wary or they'll be replaced. And that was the message to Admiral Richardson and the rest of the Navy. I'd like to offer some evidence that our government knew that the Japanese government was going to attack precisely at Pearl Harbor before they did. December the 7th, 1941. The American ambassador to Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, sent a report to the State Department on January the 27th, 1941, about 11 months prior to Pearl Harbor. Don't forget, this was 10 months prior to it, 10 or 11 months prior to the attack on December the 7th. Here's what the ambassador wrote, number 60. The ambassador to Tokyo wrote President Roosevelt and told him, the Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he has heard from many sources, including a Japanese source, that in the event of trouble breaking out between the United States and Japan, the Japanese intended to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor 10 months before it happened, and he did nothing. The focus of the attention shifted to Europe when on June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler invaded Russia. The media in America quickly shifted gears from a position of neutrality to one of retaliation. America had to get into that war to save Russia. 2 days later, Franklin Roosevelt pledged America's assistance to the Russian communists. He said this, number 61, of course, we are going to give all the aid that we possibly can to the communists in Russia. Roosevelt created, or Congress created, a program called Lend-Lease that was going to send over $11 billion, with a B, billion dollars in aid to the Russian communists. We'll discuss this more in later weeks and identify what that aid consisted of. Here's another evidence that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor months before it happened. Now we're going back to the Japanese, the Pacific Theater. Early in 1941, Congressman Martin Dies, chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, came into possession of a strategic map which gave clear proof of the intentions of the Japanese to make an assault on Pearl Harbor early in 1941. The strategic map was prepared by the Japanese Imperial Military Intelligence Department. Dies telephoned Secretary of State Cordell Hull, number 62. Hull talked to President Roosevelt. In other words, he told him about the map. Congressman Dies was then told not to release the document to the public early in 1941. In September of 1941, 2 months approximately prior to Pearl Harbor, a Japanese spy in Pearl Harbor started sending messages back to Japan detailing the locations of the ships in Pearl Harbor. These messages were intercepted and decoded. We knew the Japanese were interested in the location of the American ships in the harbor over 2 months prior to the attack, but nothing was done. No ships were moved from Pearl Harbor. In August of 1941, President Roosevelt rejected the suggestion of the Japanese Prime Minister that they meet to discuss a settlement, despite repeated warnings from the American ambassador in Tokyo that the alternative to that proposal would be a war government in Japan. In October 1941, the Prime Minister of Japan resigned and a military regime took over under General Tojo. On November the 25th, about 2 weeks prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese task force sailed from Tokyo and headed for Pearl Harbor. According to this book, entitled The 11th Hour by General Lewis W. Walt, United States Marine Corps retired, according to this book, the ship sailed on fuel supplied to Japan by a Western source. Here's what he wrote, number 63. General Walt is telling us something about the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the 1940s, Aramco, a consortium of oil companies, sold oil to the Japanese and at a lower rate than it did to the American Navy. Aramco stands for the Arabian American Oil Company, and it was, number 64, a partnership between Standard Oil Company of California and Texaco. Aramco was first created in 1937 when Standard Oil obtained a concession to prospect and develop oil in Saudi Arabia. So here we see, once again, the involvement of Standard Oil in the war on the side of the enemy. Standard Oil, an American, allegedly, oil company. I'd like to add one more bit of evidence to all of that we've previously supplied about the fact that President Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor well before it happened. On November the 25th, 1941, about 2 weeks prior to the attack, President Roosevelt met with some of his key military advisors, and one of those gentlemen there, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, commented on the meeting and the conversation. He wrote this, number 65. The President brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, meaning December the 1st, 1941, 6 days prior to the attack, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. The main question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot. How do we maneuver the Japanese into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves? Secretary Stimson wrote. It was a difficult proposition. In spite of the risks involved, however, in letting the Japanese fire the first shot, we realized that in order to have the full support of the American people, it was desirable to make sure that the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors. Did you hear that? Stimson was right. After all of the evidence that I have just presented, number 66, there should remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors. The aggressors at Pearl Harbor were not the Japanese. The aggressors were the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Let there be no doubt. At 3:30 p.m. on December the 6th, 1941, the day before the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt received an uncoded message from the Japanese government to their embassy in Washington. He read it after it had been decoded, and it said, number 67, Roosevelt said, "This means war." That was about a day prior to the attack. Roosevelt now knew for certain that the Japanese government would soon attack the United States. And all the signs pointed to Pearl Harbor as being the target, but no word was sent to Pearl Harbor. On December the 7th, 1941, the day of the attack, Roosevelt, in a radio address to the nation, said this, number 68, "We don't like it," meaning this war. "We didn't want to get into it, but we are in it, and we're going to fight it with everything we've got." President Roosevelt called December the 7th, 1941, number 69, a day of infamy. I looked up the word infamy in my dictionary, and here's the way you can define it, number 70. Infamy is defined as a disgraceful act. As far as I'm concerned, it was indeed a day of infamy. But the guilty party was not Japan. It was the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the one who attacked Pearl Harbor. In December of 1941, the Pacific Fleet consisted of 9 battleships and 3 aircraft carriers. This is a drawing of the area around Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. I've marked the location of the 8 battleships with red. Notice how most of these battleships are all tied up in a row and side by side. Even if Pearl Harbor had had some warning time, it would take quite some time to move the ships away from the island. And notice another thing. There were no aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor. 9 battleships, 8 of which were there, 3 aircraft carriers, none of which were in Pearl Harbor. None of the 3 aircraft carriers were there in the waters. They were all out to sea by specific order of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Isn't that interesting? All 8 of the battleships were damaged by the Japanese attack. It sounds to me as if Roosevelt realized that these battleships, primarily constructed during or just after World War I, were going to be obsolete during the kind of war he envisioned for the area. But the aircraft carriers would have real utility in World War II in the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, so they were all out to sea where they couldn't be damaged. Isn't that convenient? Roosevelt was stocking the basket with a bunch of old eggs and saving the good eggs for another day. This is a picture of the Pearl Harbor area taken from the air by a Japanese airplane. If you were the pilot of a Japanese airplane and you were told to sink a battleship, your reply would be, which one? In fact, I can probably get 2 battleships sitting side by side with one attack. That's not the way you arrange ships if there is even a hint, a slight suspicion that a foreign nation was considering an attack on that fleet. You disperse your fleet unless you were inviting an attack, and then you would do exactly what Franklin Roosevelt did, nothing. One more interesting thing. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese had orders to return if they had any clue that Pearl Harbor had been alerted to their impending attack. The Japanese were not to attack if America was ready to retaliate. But Pearl Harbor was not prepared, and the Japanese attacked. Any clue that we were ready for that attack, and they were told by order not to attack. That's why we didn't notify Pearl Harbor. One more critical decision was made to ensure that America could not give the appearance of being prepared. President Roosevelt ordered the airplanes at the Army Air Base to be circled with their propellers towards the center. Think about that. He said that that had to be done because he wanted to protect the planes against sabotage. Now, when the American pilots raced out to their airplanes to get them into the air, they had to physically pull the planes backward out of the circle. Planes have no reverse gear. This decision unnecessarily exposed men and their aircraft to enemy fire and caused untold deaths. But America couldn't appear to be prepared, or the Japanese would not have attacked. So Roosevelt didn't appear, America didn't appear to be prepared. By the way, the Americans knew that the Japanese attack would be successful. Trade magazine on December the 6th, 1981, said that the American Navy had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1932, 9 years prior to the attack, from the sea in a naval exercise. The American Navy was successful. Pearl Harbor, they discovered, was vulnerable from the sea. But the article gives us one more revelation. It says this, number 71. Japanese military officers on hand watched the simulation with interest. Our government invited the Japanese to witness how they could attack Pearl Harbor from the air and be successful. We had a trial run for the Japanese in 1932. The article went on, number 72. Indeed, as early as 1931, Japanese Naval Academy students were posed this question on their final exams. How would you carry out a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? Even with all of this evidence that Roosevelt knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor well in advance, there are still those who will not believe it. Walter Scott writes a section in Parade magazine called Personality Parade. On February the 28th, 1982, he was asked this question, number 73. Is it true that Roosevelt knew that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor in World War II? Mr. Scott answered in his little column in Parade magazine, and he said simply, number 74, not true. America did not know that Japan was going to attack. Now you're going to have to decide for yourself. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that Roosevelt knew years in advance the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. What was the cost of the attack on Pearl Harbor? The final toll was number 75, 2,341 U.S. servicemen dead, 1,143 wounded. Number 76, 18 ships sunk or heavily damaged. And number 77, more than 200 Army, Air Corps, and Navy planes destroyed. On December the 10th, 1941, Germany declared war on the United States under the tripartite agreement. Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and now Germany declared war on the United States. So now the Roosevelt administration had a two-front war to contend with, just like it was planned. On December the 17th, 1941, Admiral Husband Kimmel, the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, was relieved of his command and about 3 weeks later retired. Someone had to take the blame for our unpreparedness, and someone volunteered Admiral Husband Kimmel. After the war was over, congressmen looked into the causes of Pearl Harbor, and here are their conclusions. Number 75. Number 1, the United States did not provoke the attack. That's what they concluded. Number 2, there was no evidence that this president, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, or the Secretary of Navy provoked the attack. Number 3, the government made every effort to avoid the war. Number 4, the attack was caused by failures of Army and Navy to detect hostile forces. And number 5, the errors made were errors of judgment and not derelictions of duty. Notice what they just said. Our government said, number 71, no one was at fault except the Army and the Navy, and they weren't at fault either. That's what they said. I believe that the last conclusion, that no one was at fault, was to clear the Roosevelt's administration, which had the greatest guilt of all. I'd like to go to the blackboard now and briefly draw a map of Europe to help you understand the next area of discussion, the European theater. Please forgive my drawing, but I didn't have a map, so I'm going to do it myself just quickly over here on the board. This is going to represent England. This will be Europe. This will be Russia. Here are these countries in the middle between Germany and France and England. Germany is now fighting a two-front war. They're attacking this way through France to get to England. They're also attacking through these small countries in the middle here, the mid-European countries, to attack Russia, which is here. This is Russia, Germany. This would be England over here, and France here. Notice they're fighting a two-front war, attacking through France to the west and attacking Russia to the east. Now with that in mind, let's get into the next part of the war. After the war got going in Europe, plans were made by the Allied command to invade the continent in an effort to defeat Hitler's Nazi Germany. Once again, now we're going to have to defeat Germany in their war against Russia and Germany. The original plans were made in 1942 for a 1943 invasion. The plan was shelved for a year until 1944, and this decision materially affected the course of world history and completely rewrote the map of Europe. In other words, we're going to attack, but not this year. We're going to wait a year. Now let's talk about why we waited a year. The plan was shelved for a year, as I said, until 1944, and this decision materially affected the course of world history and completely rewrote the map of Europe. That decision not to invade Europe for one more year allowed Communist Russia one more year to move west, assimilating Eastern European nations into the Communist Empire. In other words, the reason Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Eastern Europe, other Eastern European nations, are communist today in the 80s is because someone in authority in the Allied governments wanted Russia to occupy those nations. According to this book, 1943, The Victory That Never Was, that decision was made to delay the war for one more year by Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England. I don't know why Churchill decided to delay the invasion, but that single decision had more impact on the face of the future than almost any other made during the war. Churchill condemned entire nations to the communists by delaying the invasion of Europe for 1 year. I'll give you some more evidence later that it was Winston Churchill who actually built the Iron Curtain around Russia. It was planned for Russia to occupy Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, etc., by those who fought the war on the Allied side years in advance. The war in Europe continued, and in 1943, Germany attempted to surrender. In 1943, Germany attempted to surrender. In the spring of 1943, George Earle, the U.S. naval attaché in Istanbul, was approached by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German Secret Service. Canaris said that, number one, there were many sensible German people who loved their fatherland and who greatly disliked Adolf Hitler, feeling that Hitler was leading their nation down a destructive path. Canaris told Earle, Canaris told the American attaché that these Germans would capture Hitler, take over the German government, and then surrender in 1943 to the Allied nations. There was only one condition for that surrender. Number two, there must be no Soviet advance into Central Europe. Notice the German freedom fighters wanted only one condition for their surrender in 1943, 2 years before the war ended. They didn't want Russia to occupy any part of Central Europe. That is precisely what happened at the end of the war. It sounds like Admiral Canaris had somehow read the script. He knew what this conspiracy wanted. He knew how the war was going to end, and he tried to prevent it. Earle corresponded with President Roosevelt, and he waited for a reply. None came. 30 days later, Admiral Canaris got back in touch with Earle, and he had to tell the Admiral, Earle told the Admiral that there had been no reply from Roosevelt. Earle sent a second message to President Roosevelt, and still he received no reply. He tried again with a third message, and once again received no reply. Apparently, Ambassador Earle did not know what the game plan was. He was trying to help. He was an American. Russia was going to occupy Central Europe after the war, and the plan was going to be carried out. And we couldn't have the Germans surrendering and ending the war without the plans allowing Russia to occupy Central Europe. It is the only thing that makes sense. It is the only explanation that fits the facts. Ambassador Earle returned to the United States. He says, number 3, I decided to make my views and observations known to wake up the American people about what was really going on. President Roosevelt specifically forbade me to make my views known to the public. Was he welcomed as a hero? No. He was ordered to Samoa. These events took place 18 months prior to the end of World War II. Roosevelt did not want the war to end. He did not want to impede Russia's advance into Central Europe. Now we can start to see just what this war was all about. World War I was fought, number 4, to make the world safe for democracy. World War II was fought, number 5, to make the world safe for communism. For his efforts to end the war, Admiral Canaris was captured and hanged by Adolf Hitler. General Albert Wedemeyer wrote about this decision by President Roosevelt. He wrote this, number 6. If Washington had accepted Canaris's offer, the war might have ended in 1943. Countless lives would have been saved, and the Allies would not have supplanted one dangerous ideology with another. The entire map of Europe would have been different. Russia was to occupy Central Europe. That was the plan. The war in Europe continued and ended in 1945. We'll get back to the war with Japan in a few minutes. On March the 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in which he said, quote, "An iron curtain has descended in Europe," unquote. He didn't say that he was the one who built the Iron Curtain. Watch this. This is amazing. Winston Churchill was constructed, the Iron Curtain was constructed in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference was attended by Winston Churchill for England, Franklin Roosevelt for the United States, and Joseph Stalin for the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill wrote about that conference in his book entitled Triumph and Tragedy. Here is how Winston Churchill built the Iron Curtain. Number 7. Winston Churchill said to Stalin, "Let us settle our affairs. How will it do to have 90% predominance in Romania for you, and for us to have 90% of the say in Greece, and 50% about in Yugoslavia?" I wrote on a half sheet of paper, Romania, Russia 90%, others 10%. Greece, Great Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50. Hungary 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, others 25%. Stalin took a pencil and made a large tick upon it and then passed it back to me. It was settled in no more time than it takes to set it down. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper and communize entire nations. Nikolai Lenin planned an entire bloody revolution to communize Russia. It took years to succeed and millions of dead people. He killed as many as 40 million people. If he had only known that all he had to do was sit down with Winston Churchill and they could have communized Russia in a few minutes. That's how easy it can be. Notice how effective Churchill was. He said Yugoslavia would be 50% communist and 50% free. For 35 years, Marshal Tito was head of Yugoslavia. He was described as a pro-West communist. He was a communist, but a good communist who liked the West. That's what we were told. Notice, Tito was playing a role. According to Winston Churchill, he was supposed to be a 50-50 communist. And for 35 years, Marshal Tito played a role, just like he was supposed to. Additional evidence that Churchill built the Iron Curtain has been surfacing since the war. This is an article that says that Winston Churchill also agreed to number 8, Soviet domination of Poland in exchange for Stalin's support of British interests in the Far East. Those who read knew this in 1948. This is a book entitled I Saw Poland Betrayed. An American ambassador reports to the American people, written by the United States ambassador to Poland from 1944 to 1947, Arthur Bliss Lane. It was written by our ambassador. He tried to tell the American people how our government wanted Poland to go communist when it did. He tried to warn us. but few were listening. Ambassador Lane had not been told of Churchill's agreement with Stalin, and no one in America listened because they hadn't been told either. But these weren't the only areas that the Allies took over from the rightful owners to give them to Russia. At the wartime conference at Tehran, Roosevelt gave Russia two warm water ports, Port Arthur and Darien, that belonged to the Chinese. At Yalta in 1945, Roosevelt gave Russia 3 votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations. America has 1 vote in the General Assembly. That was a compromise. Russia had asked for 15 votes in the General Assembly, 1 for each of the Soviet republics. As far as I can tell, Roosevelt did not ask for 48 votes for the United States, 1 for each of the states. He granted them 3 votes in the General Assembly. 1 nation, 1 vote, not if you're Russia. You have 3 votes. The American ambassador to Russia, William C. Bullitt, said this about the Yalta Agreement, number 9. No more unnecessary, disgraceful, and potentially disastrous document has ever been signed by a president of the United States. He could have said that about all of the secret arrangements made at Yalta, Potsdam, and Tehran, these conferences that ended World War II. Why did Roosevelt and Churchill give Russia all of that territory? Roosevelt answered that question on March the 8th, 1944, when he said this, number 10. I think the Russians, this is what Franklin Roosevelt is saying. Our president, Roosevelt, says, I think the Russians are perfectly friendly. They aren't trying to gobble up the rest of Europe. These fears that the Russians are going to try and dominate Europe, I personally don't think there's anything to it. William C. Bullitt, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, as I just said that Roosevelt told him, number 11, I just have a hunch, that Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country. And I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask nothing in return, he won't try to annex anything and will work for a world of democracy and peace. Winston Churchill echoed that sentiment when he said this in 1945. Number 12. The impression I brought back is that Stalin wishes to live in honorable friendship with the Western democracies. Boy, we're buying a line, aren't we? Did Stalin really work for a world of peace? Was he perfectly friendly? Was he honorable? The answers to those questions came very quickly, within 2 years of those comments. We can answer that question with a situation where we can see how brutal Joseph Stalin was. As the Russians were advancing into Germany in the later days of the war, they were brutally, and I mean brutally, butchering the German people. The Russian defector, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, was a captain in the Russian army during the war. And here's what he said about the end and what the Russians were doing. Number 13. All of us Russians knew very well that if the girls were German, they could be raped and then shot. The reason he said that, Solzhenitsyn said that, was because he had read a Russian propaganda leaflet given by the millions to the Russian soldiers at the end of the war as they were sweeping west. It read, number 14, go say to yourself as we read this, good old Joseph Stalin, he's friendly, honorable, and a man of peace. Number 15, kill, nothing in Germany is guiltless, neither the living nor the yet unborn. Follow the words of Comrade Stalin and crush forever the fascist beast in its den. Break the racial pride of the German woman. Take her as your legitimate booty. Kill, you brave soldiers of the victorious Soviet army. Yes, Joseph Stalin was perfectly friendly, perfectly honorable, a man of peace. This entire scenario has been summarized thusly, number 16. The Russians swept the native population clean in a manner that had no parallel since the days of the Asiatic hordes. Yes, Joseph Stalin was friendly. Yes, he was willing to live in honorable friendship, just like Roosevelt and Churchill said. But I've got more evidence to show that these two were dramatically wrong. Joseph Stalin was a butcher. I'd like to go back to June of 1941 when Germany invaded Russia. I'd like to introduce you to this book entitled The East Came West, written by an Englishman, Peter J. Huxley Blythe. There it is, The East Came West. The author, as I said, is an Englishman, and he's explored the early history of the war. As you might recall, as I drew on my map, Germany was moving east through Russia, opposed by the Russian army in June of 1941. Mr. Huxley Blythe says this, number 17, the fierce resistance they had anticipated failed to materialize. Instead, the Germans were greeted by the overwhelming majority of the population as liberators. It was the Russian people's first opportunity to escape from the terrorism of the communist regime. The Russians were greeting the Germans as liberators. The Germans have come to liberate us from communism. The Russian soldiers responded in a similar manner as well. Number 18. Mass surrenders of Red soldiers became an everyday occurrence, and the majority of the prisoners immediately petitioned the German Supreme Command for permission to take up arms and fight alongside the German army against a common enemy and to liberate their homeland. Number 19. Within 5 months of the invasion of Russia by the Germans had collected 2 million prisoners. And by March the 1st, 1942, the staggering total was 3,600,000. These soldiers were aware, these Russians who surrendered to the Germans to fight alongside with the Germans, were aware that if they were captured by the Russian army wearing a German uniform, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but as traitors to the Russian homeland and shot on the spot. But they surrendered anyway, 3,600,000 of them within months after the war started. When the war ended, these soldiers surrendered, as I said, as did the German soldiers, to the American army.